All right, so today we're going deep on Lorenzo Valla.
Sounds good.
He's a really fascinating figure, especially if you're into the history of, like, how philosophical ideas develop.
Yeah, definitely a key figure in the Renaissance.
Right. Like, you could even think of him as kind of an early myth buster for philosophy.
Haha, I like that.
He really went after some of those big philosophical systems that everyone just took for granted back then.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who are, really into philosophy themselves, I think they'll find it really interesting to see how Vella questioned assumptions that we still debate today.
Exactly. And the main source we're using for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Valla.
Yeah, it's super comprehensive. It lays out his whole life and the impact of all his work.
Right. It's a really great starting point. So our goal today is to really break down Valla's critiques of what they called scholastic Aristotelian philosophy.
Right, the dominant school of thought in his time.
Yeah. And we'll look at how he tried to offer alternatives, especially his use of language analysis to critique philosophical ideas.
Which is a really fascinating approach.
Yeah. And then we can even step back and think about why his work still matters today. Like, what does it tell us about the connection between Renaissance, humanism, and philosophy in general?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah, even for philosophers working today.
Mm.
So let's just start with Valla himself.
Yeah.
What kind of guy was he?
Well, he was born in Rome around 1406.
Hmm.
His family had ties to the people curious, so from a young age, he was connected to some pretty powerful people.
Wow, so he was practically born into the heart of the church.
Oh, right, exactly. And he also crossed paths with some of the leading humanist thinkers of the time, like Leonardo Bruni and Poggio Bracciolini.
Oh, wow, those are some big names.
Yeah, they were really influential figures, so those early connections definitely shaped his intellectual development.
It sounds like he had a pretty impressive upbringing. But the entry mentions that he also had a knack for ruffling feathers. Like he wasn't afraid to step on toes.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
He had a really sharp and polemical mind. He wasn't shy about criticizing other scholars.
Like, for example.
Well, he famously critiqued an elegy by Antonio Lassi.
What's an elegy again?
It's kind of like a mournful poem, usually written to commemorate someone who's died.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so he criticized this other guy's poem.
Yeah, and it caused quite a stir. And then there's this whole thing about his preference for Quintilian over Cicero.
Those are two giants of rhetoric.
Exactly. And for a long time, people thought Valla was just taking sides in this big rhetorical debate.
Right, picking his favorite.
But some newly discovered evidence suggests he was actually doing something a bit more subtle. He was comparing the specific text, the pseudo-Quintilian declamation gladiator, to Cicero's Pro Ligario.
Oh, so he was doing some close textual analysis.
Yeah, and this is super interesting for us as philosophers because it shows how Valla was already using linguistic analysis to examine these big ideas.
That's a great point. And this actually leads us to one of his most controversial works, his dialogue on pleasure, which he later revised and renamed On the True Good.
Ah, yes, that one caused quite a few eyebrows to raise.
I can imagine. The entry says he basically equates Christian charity and beatitude with hedonistic pleasure.
Yeah, he also rejects Stoic virtue.
Whoa, hold on. That's a pretty radical reinterpretation of some pretty fundamental ethical concepts.
It is. And what's even more interesting is that even after he revised the dialogue, that core idea stuck around, this blend of Epicureanism and Christian thought. It's like he was trying to create a whole new ethical system.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And, it seems like his willingness to challenge the status quo wasn't just limited to philosophical debates.
Oh, no. He had a history of ruffling feathers in other areas, too. Like, he actually had to flee Pavia after he criticized this famous jurist, Bartolus of Sassoferrato.
Seriously. A philosopher on the run from the law.
Uh-huh. Yeah, apparently his critiques of Bartolus really angered the legal community.
That's wild. So after Pavia, where did he end up?
Well, he spent some time at the court of Alfonso of Aragon in Naples, and despite complaining about a lack of resources, he actually got a lot done there.
Like what?
Well, he finished the first draft of his critique of scholastic philosophy.
Okay, that's a big one.
Yeah, and he also wrote his incredibly influential work on Latin language and style, the Elegantiae Linguae Latinae.
Which basically became like the style guide for Renaissance humanism.
Exactly. It was hugely influential.
So even though he was complaining, he was still super productive.
Uh-huh. Sounds familiar, right?
Definitely. And of course, we can't forget his most famous accomplishment, exposing the donation of Constantine as a forgery.
Oh, yeah. That was a major bombshell.
Using his philological skills to basically rewrite history.
It totally changed the understanding of papal authority.
Talk about challenging the establishment.
Right.
And it wasn't just the donation of Constantine. He also compared St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, with the original Greek New Testament.
Which was a really important step in the development of critical biblical scholarship.
Right, like he was saying, hey, let's go back to the source and see what it really said.
Exactly. And on top of that, he even wrote this dialogue on the profession of the religious, where he questioned the whole idea of monastic vows.
It's incredible how much he challenged during his lifetime. He didn't shy away from anything.
He really didn't. And even when he returned to Rome and worked for the papacy, he continued to revise his earlier works, translate important historical texts like Thucydides and Herodotus, and even keep up his intellectual feuds with people like Poggio.
He was a busy guy.
Always working. He was actually in the middle of revising his major work on dialectics when he died.
Wow, so he was dedicated to his work until the very end.
Absolutely. And, the fact that his grave marker was removed from the Lateran later on really shows just how controversial his ideas were.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
But despite all the pushback, his influence is undeniable. His philological methods were hugely important for later humanists like Angelo Poliziano and Erasmus.
Right. He really laid the groundwork for them. And even thinkers like Luther and Leibniz engaged with his ideas on free will.
So even though he had his critics, he clearly made a lasting impact.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into the details of his critique of scholastic philosophy, which starts with this big book, right?
Yeah, the Repastinatio Dialectis et Philosophiae, or dialectics for short.
And the title itself is interesting. It means replowing,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, it's like he's saying he wants to completely overturn the existing intellectual landscape and start fresh.
And his main tool for doing this was language.
Exactly. He argued that philosophy should be based on common sense and everyday language.
Like how people actually talk and think.
Right. He thought scholasticism had become way too abstract and disconnected from how people actually experience the world.
And this is actually really relevant to philosophy today, right?
Right.
Like we still debate the relationship between formal systems and ordinary language.
All the time. It's a fundamental question in the philosophy of language.
So how did Valla actually go about replowing philosophy?
Well, one of his main strategies was to simplify things. For example, he took Aristotle's 10 categories and reduced them to just 3: substance, quality, and action.
10 down to 3. That's a pretty drastic simplification.
It is, and he linked these 3 categories to grammar the parts of speech.
So substance is like a noun, quality is like an adjective, and action is like a verb.
Right. Although he did acknowledge that the correspondence wasn't always perfect.
So what happened to the other 7 categories?
He argued that they could ultimately be understood as aspects of quality or action based on how we use language. For example, when we answer the question, what kind of thing is it? With a quantitative expression like 6 feet tall.
We're describing a quality of that thing, its height.
Exactly. So for Valla, quantity is just a specific way of talking about quality.
And this all comes back to his emphasis on loquendi consuetudo, right? Like the custom of speaking.
Exactly. He thought that the way we use language reflects how we understand the world. And this idea is still debated today by philosophers who are interested in linguistic realism.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think that our language might actually shape our reality.
It is, and Valla was one of the first to really explore this connection.
So we've talked about categories. What about substance itself? Did Valla have anything interesting to say about that?
Yeah, he actually struggled with the concept of substance. He found it hard to imagine substance as something separate from its qualities and actions.
So he was skeptical of substance.
In a way, yeah. Like he recognized that it was a tricky concept to pin down.
That's interesting because this actually reminds me of Locke's later concept of substance as this kind of unknowable substratum.
That's a really good comparison. They both recognize the difficulty of getting at the essence of substance.
It's like this fundamental philosophical problem that keeps popping up.
Definitely. And it's still something philosophers grapple with today.
It's also interesting to compare Valla's approach to categories with William of Occam's.
Oh yeah, Occam wanted to keep all 10 of Aristotle's categories, but he thought of them as categories of terms rather than things in the world.
So for Occam, it was all about logic and language.
Exactly. But Valla wanted to go further and actually reduce the real aspects of things based on how we use language.
So they had very different approaches.
They did. Occam was more focused on the internal consistency of our logical systems, while Valla was more interested in how language reflects our actual experience of the world.
And this ties into Valla's critique of those super abstract terms that scholastics love to use, like being, thing, essence, all that jazz.
Yeah, he wasn't a fan. He thought those terms were too vague and confusing.
So instead of being, he preferred to just say thing.
Exactly. He thought it was more straightforward and less likely to lead to muddled thinking.
And he went even further. He rejected a lot of the fancy new terms that scholastic philosophers were coming up with, like entitas, hechitas, quiditas,
He thought they were just making things more complicated than they needed to be.
like unnecessary jargon.
Exactly. He was all about clarity and precision in language. And this actually connects to his rejection of the scholastic distinction between abstract and concrete terms.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the scholastics made this big distinction between abstract terms like humanity and concrete terms like human.
But Vella's didn't buy it.
Right. He argued that both types of terms ultimately refer to the same concrete thing, like a human being.
So he was basically saying that this abstract, concrete distinction was artificial and didn't reflect how we actually use language.
Exactly. And this is another example of how he used language analysis to challenge some of the basic assumptions of scholastic philosophy.
So Valla was all about bringing philosophy back down to earth,
Yeah.
making it more relatable to everyday experience.
Exactly. And he even used common sense and the limits of human imagination to critique some of the more out there ideas of scholasticism.
Likewise.
Well, for example, he took issue with the idea of prime matter without form or form without matter.
Those are some pretty abstract concepts.
They are. And Valla argued that they were basically impossible to imagine. He thought they were just empty abstractions that didn't correspond to anything real.
So he was using the power of imagination as a philosophical tool.
Yeah. He thought that if you couldn't imagine something, it was probably because it didn't actually exist.
Makes sense. And he also applied this same logic to the scholastic definitions of lines and points.
Right. He argued that lines and points are just tools for measuring physical bodies. They don't exist as independent entities with their own quantity.
So basically he was saying that asking what a line or a point is kind of a category mistake.
Yeah, like you're asking the wrong kind of question.
That's a really interesting point. And it shows how Valla was willing to use a variety of approaches to challenge scholastic thinking.
He wasn't afraid to think outside the box.
So we've talked about Valla's critique of metaphysics and logic. Now let's move on to natural philosophy. Did he have any problems with Aristotle's ideas about the natural world?
Oh yeah, he definitely did. He thought that a lot of Aristotle's claims didn't match up with what we can actually observe.
So he was an empiricist.
In a way, yeah. He emphasized the importance of everyday experience and common sense when evaluating scientific claims.
That's pretty revolutionary for his time.
It was. And he challenged a lot of the basic tenets of Aristotelian physics, like the idea that motion generates heat.
So he was skeptical of that.
Yeah. He pointed out that if that were true, then things like lead projectiles should get super hot when they're flying through the air.
Which they don't.
Right. And he also questioned the idea that elements can transform into each other.
Like alchemy.
Yeah, he thought that was nonsense. And he even rejected the idea that life can spontaneously generate.
Which was a pretty common belief back then.
It was. But Valla thought it was more likely that life came from other life.
That's a pretty modern-sounding idea.
It is. And it shows how Valla was ahead of his time in some ways.
So he was willing to challenge even the most fundamental assumptions about the natural world.
He was. And his critiques were really effective. They helped to chip away at the authority of Aristotle's physics.
And it wasn't just empirical observations that motivated his critiques.
Right. He also had some theological concerns. He thought that Aristotle's natural philosophy downplayed the power of God.
Like how?
Well, for example, Aristotle talked about the cosmos as a kind of living organism.
Which kind of implies that it's self-sufficient and doesn't need a creator.
Exactly, and Valla thought that was a dangerous idea. He wanted to reassert God as the sole and omnipotent creator of everything.
So he saw Aristotle's philosophy as a threat to Christian theology.
In a way, yeah. He thought that it gave too much power to nature and not enough to God.
And this actually connects to his critique of the tree of porphyry, right? That hierarchical classification system that's so important in philosophy.
Yes. He had a few problems with it. For starters, he didn't like the fact that substance was at the top of the tree.
Which is kind of ironic considering his skepticism about substance.
Haha, yeah, it is. But he also thought the tree of porphyry didn't have a proper place for human beings who are both body and soul.
And he didn't like that it applied the category animal to both God and angels.
Right. He thought those were inappropriate categories for spiritual beings.
So he came up with his own alternative.
Yeah, he proposed a system with 3 separate trees. One for spiritual beings, one for corporeal beings, and one for animals.
That's pretty ambitious.
It was. And it shows how Valla was trying to develop a more comprehensive and coherent system of classification.
But even his system ran into problems, right?
Yeah. Like, where do you put Christ, who's both divine and human?
Right. That's a tough one.
It is. It highlights the difficulty of creating a perfect system of classification.
There are always going to be exceptions and edge cases.
Definitely. So we've talked about category substance and natural philosophy. What about the soul? Did Valla have any thoughts on that?
Well, the entry says he basically adopted an Augustinian view of the soul.
Which means?
Well, for Augustine, the soul is incorporeal, spiritual, and created in the image of God.
Okay, so it's not material.
Right.
Oh.
And they have three main faculties: memory, intellect, and will.
And Valla agreed with all of this.
Yeah, he didn't really go into the more fine-grained distinctions that the scholastics were so fond of.
Like what?
Like all the different types of intellect or the various functions of the soul.
He just kept it simple.
Yeah, he was more interested in the big picture, the soul's essential nature.
Which he saw as active and creative?
Right. He emphasized the soul's ability to remember, to understand, and to choose.
Which is very different from the Aristotelian view of the soul as a kind of passive receiver of information.
Exactly. For Valla, the soul is dynamic and engaged with the world.
It's not just a blank slate.
Right. And this view of the soul clearly has theological implications.
Absolutely. It reinforces the idea that humans are created in the image of God and have a special place in creation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground metaphysics, logic, natural philosophy, the soul. It's clear that Valla had some serious issues with scholastic philosophy. But how did he approach Aristotelian logic?
Well, he thought that logic should be more about persuasion than about following strict rules.
Oh, he was more interested in rhetoric.
Exactly. He saw dialectic as just one part of the broader art of persuasion.
And he wasn't a big fan of the syllogism?
No, he thought it was too artificial and didn't reflect how people actually reason.
He had a point. Like, if you say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, it's kind of obvious.
It is, yeah. It's not exactly groundbreaking reasoning.
So what did he propose instead?
Well, he followed Quintilian in emphasizing the importance of proof.
Like evidence and arguments.
Right, and he said that the order of the premises and the conclusion in a syllogism didn't really matter.
It was more about what was most persuasive in a particular context.
Exactly. He was all about adapting your arguments to your audience.
And he was even willing to accept syllogisms that didn't follow the traditional Aristotelian rules.
Yeah, he called them deviant syllogisms.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like, God is in every place, therefore God is in Tartarus.
Tartarus. That's like the underworld in Greek mythology.
Exactly. So this syllogism would be considered invalid by traditional logic because it has a particular conclusion drawn from a universal premise.
But Villa was okay with it.
Yeah, he thought it was a perfectly valid argument.
Wow, that's pretty radical.
It is. It shows how he was willing to break with tradition in order to develop a more flexible and effective system of logic.
And he completely disregarded the principle of dicide omnia nullo.
Which is basically the rule that says if something is true of all members of a category, it's true of any individual in that category.
Right, like if all dogs are mammals, then my dog Fido is a mammal.
Exactly. But Valla didn't think this rule was all that important.
He was more interested in the practical art of persuasion.
Yeah. He thought that getting bogged down in technicalities like that could actually hinder effective argumentation.
And he also didn't like the third figure of the syllogism, or using letters to represent terms in logical argument.
Right, he thought all of that was too abstract and disconnected from how people actually use language.
So he was really trying to ground logic in everyday experience.
Exactly. He wanted to make it more practical and useful.
And this led him to examine other types of arguments too, like dilemmas, paradoxes, and so-rights.
Yeah, he was interested in all sorts of informal reasoning.
And some scholars even think that this might indicate a broader skepticism about the power of formal logic.
It's possible. He was definitely aware of the limitations of logic.
And his analysis of the so-rights paradox is particularly interesting.
The one about the heap of sand.
Yeah. Like if you take away 1 grain of sand from a heap, it's still a heap. But if you keep taking away grains, eventually you'll have no heap left.
So where's the line? When does it stop being a heap?
Exactly. It's a classic paradox that highlights the vagueness of language.
And Valla was fascinated by these kinds of puzzles.
He also had a lot to say about dilemmas,
Especially the one about Protagoras and Euathlus.
the famous legal case.
Yeah, Protagoras was this famous sophist who agreed to teach Euathlus rhetoric on the condition that Euathlus would pay him his fee once he won his first case.
But Euathlus never took on any cases.
Right, so Protagoras sued him.
And then Euathlus countered with his own lawsuit.
It's a classic catch-22 situation.
And Valla had some interesting thoughts on how to resolve it.
Yeah, he rejected the idea that the judges should just abstain from making a decision.
He thought that was a cop-out.
Exactly. He believed that there was always a way to find a just resolution.
Even in the most difficult cases.
And this shows how committed he was to the idea of using language to achieve practical ends.
He wasn't just interested in theoretical debates. He wanted to make a difference in the real world.
Absolutely. And this practical focus also informed his views on deceptive arguments.
Like fallacies.
Yeah. He thought that the best way to counter a deceptive argument was to carefully examine the words being used and the context in which they were uttered.
So it's all about paying attention to the nuances of language.
Exactly. He didn't think there was any need for a bunch of complicated rules or procedures.
He trusted in the power of human reason and judgment.
And this actually led him to criticize Aristotle's sophistical refutations.
Which is a whole book about how to identify and refute fallacies.
Yeah, Valla thought it was too focused on technicalities and not enough on the broader context of argumentation.
So he preferred a more holistic approach.
Exactly. And he even quoted from the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which says that knowing too much about logical fallacies can actually hinder effective argumentation.
That's an interesting point.
It suggests that sometimes it's better to just focus on the overall meaning and intent of an argument rather than getting bogged down in the details.
So Valla was all about practicality and common sense.
Yeah, he wanted to make logic more relevant to everyday life.
And this also comes through in his analysis of propositions.
Right. He considered a much wider range of signs or markers than the traditional logicians.
Like what?
Well, for example, he was interested in words like likely and unlikely, which he saw as a kind of modality.
So he was expanding the scope of logic to include more of the nuances of natural language.
Exactly. He thought that the traditional logical categories were too narrow and didn't capture the full richness of human expression.
So who were Valla's main philosophical opponents?
Well, he had a particular disdain for Aristotle, Boethius Porphyry, and Peter of Spain.
Those are some big names.
They were. He even had a collective term for them, the Niceo Peripatetica.
The Peripatetic Nation?
Yeah. He saw them as representing the old guard, the establishment that he was trying to overthrow.
And it's interesting that he didn't really engage with the later medieval scholastic thinkers.
No, he seemed to think that they were all basically following in the footsteps of Aristotle and making the same mistakes.
So he thought that exposing the flaws in Aristotle's system was enough to discredit the whole scholastic tradition.
Yeah, he didn't see the need to go through and refute every single scholastic argument.
He was more interested in attacking the foundations.
Exactly. And this is actually a key difference between him and William of Ockham.
Who we talked about earlier.
Right. Ockham was a nominalist, which means he believed that universal concepts are just names that we give to groups of things.
But Valla didn't buy that.
No, he thought that universal concepts actually refer to real things in the world.
So they had very different views on the relationship between language and reality.
They did, and this is just one example of how Valla's philosophy diverged from the mainstream scholastic tradition.
So he was truly an independent thinker.
He was. He wasn't afraid to go against the grain and challenge the status quo.
And the entry ends by talking about his disdain for the philosophical establishment at universities.
Yeah, he wasn't a big fan of academia.
He saw it as stifling and uncreative.
Exactly. He much preferred to work independently.
Which is probably why he was able to be so innovative.
It's definitely possible. So we've talked a lot about Valla's critique of scholastic philosophy, but what about his own positive contributions to philosophy, like his moral philosophy?
Well, his main work on ethics is his dialogue on pleasure, which he later revised and renamed On the True Good.
And as we mentioned earlier, he makes some pretty controversial claims in that dialogue.
Like equating Christian charity and beatitude with pleasure.
Yeah, and rejecting Stoic virtue.
It's a very unique blend of Epicureanism and Christianity.
It is. And it's one of the most distinctive aspects of Valla's thought.
He even repeats these ideas in his Repastinatio.
He does, so it's clearly something he was really committed to.
So how does he justify this equation of Christian love with pleasure?
Well, he argues that we don't pursue virtue for its own sake.
Like the Stoics believed.
Right. Instead, he says that we pursue virtue because it leads to pleasure.
So virtue is just a means to an end.
Exactly. And the ultimate end is pleasure, or delectatio.
And this is especially true in the afterlife.
Right. He believed that heaven is a place of eternal bliss and joy.
So he saw Christian love as ultimately a form of hedonism.
In a way.
Yeah.
But it's a very specific kind of hedonism.
One that's based on love and selflessness.
Exactly. And this actually leads him to make a very provocative claim about God.
Which is?
He says that God is loved for the sake of love itself.
Not for God's own sake or as a means to something else.
Right. He's saying that love is its own reward.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It challenges the traditional Christian view that we should love God because he's worthy of our love.
And it also seems to contradict his earlier claim that virtue is pursued for the sake of pleasure.
It does. Yeah, there's definitely some tension there.
Like he's trying to have it both ways.
It's possible, but I think what he's trying to get at is that love is the highest form of pleasure.
It's the most fulfilling and satisfying experience we can have.
Exactly, and that's why we should love God for the sake of love itself.
Because it's the most pleasurable thing we can do.
Right, and this actually connects to his distinction between two types of pleasure.
Earthly and heavenly.
Exactly. He says that earthly pleasures are fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying.
But heavenly pleasures are eternal and truly fulfilling.
And this is where his Christian faith really comes through.
He believed that our ultimate destiny is to be united with God in heaven.
And that this union will bring us the greatest possible pleasure.
So his moral philosophy is ultimately a kind of Christian hedonism.
You could say that, but it's a very complex and nuanced form of hedonism.
One that's grounded in love, selflessness, and the hope of eternal life.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about his views on pleasure and love.
Yeah.
What about his views on virtue?
Well, he had some interesting things to say about that, too. For starters, he didn't agree with Aristotle's idea of virtue as a mean between two vices.
Like courage being the mean between cowardice and recklessness.
Right. Valla thought that was too simplistic.
He pointed out that each virtue actually has its own specific opposite.
Like courage is the opposite of cowardice.
Exactly, and generosity is the opposite of stinginess.
So he didn't think it made sense to talk about virtues as being means.
No, he thought that was just confusing.
And he also had a different view of what virtue actually is.
He saw it as an affect or emotion of the will.
So it's not a habit like Aristotle thought.
Right, Valla believed that virtue could change instantly.
Like you could go from being cowardly to being courageous in a split second.
Exactly. And he also separated virtue from knowledge or prudence.
Which are usually considered to be closely related.
They are. But Valla saw them as distinct faculties.
So knowledge is about understanding the world.
And virtue is about choosing to do the right thing.
And this raises some interesting questions about the relationship between our desires and our reason.
It does. Yeah. Like, how much control do we actually have over our actions?
And where does morality ultimately reside?
These are questions that philosophers are still debating today.
And Valla's ideas definitely contribute to that debate.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to one final point. The entry mentions that Valla also had some thoughts on predestination.
Predestination, like the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned.
Exactly. And Valla seems to have been sympathetic to this view.
Which is kind of surprising considering his emphasis on free will.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. But in his dialogue on free will, he stresses that God's will is ultimately inscrutable.
Meaning we can't fully understand it.
Right. And he says that even though we have free will, God already knows what choices we're going to make.
So it's kind of like a paradox.
It is, yeah. It's one of those theological mysteries that's difficult to wrap your head around.
And Valla doesn't really try to resolve it,
No,
Yeah.
he basically just acknowledges the tension and leaves it at that.
which is probably the wisest course of action.
Haha, probably. Okay, so
Alright.
to sum up Valla's moral philosophy, it's a pretty unique blend of ideas.
Hedonism, voluntarism, and even some empiricism.
Exactly. And it's definitely influenced by his Christian faith,
But it also contains some potential inconsistencies.
which is understandable given how many different sources he was drawing from.
Aristotle, the Stoics, the Bible Epicurus.
He was trying to synthesize a lot of different traditions.
And that's bound to create some friction.
Definitely. But overall, I think his moral philosophy is really fascinating and thought-provoking.
I agree. Okay, so now let's shift gears and talk about Valla's legacy. What's his lasting impact on intellectual history?
Well, there's no doubt that he made huge contributions to historical, classical, and biblical scholarship.
He was a pioneer of textual criticism.
Exactly. He really emphasized the importance of understanding texts in their original historical and cultural contexts.
Which is something we take for granted today, but it was pretty revolutionary back then.
It was, and his philological methods were incredibly influential.
They paved the way for later humanists like Erasmus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But his attempts to reform scholastic philosophy and logic haven't always been so well received.
Some historians of medieval philosophy are pretty skeptical of his approach.
They argue that he wasn't rigorous enough and that he often misinterpreted the scholastics.
So they see him as more of a polemicist than a serious philosopher.
In a way, yeah. But I think his critiques are still valuable, even if they're not always perfectly accurate.
They force us to question our assumptions and to think about things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And the entry highlights two main reasons why his critique of scholasticism is so important.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first of all, he helped to broaden the philosophical horizon.
By introducing new ideas from Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, and Neoplatonism.
Exactly. He showed that there were other ways of thinking about the world besides Aristotelianism.
Which was a huge step forward.
It was. And even though he was mainly motivated by theological concerns, his critiques of Aristotle helped to pave the way for the scientific revolution.
Because they showed that Aristotle wasn't always right.
Exactly. And second of all, he showed that it's okay to question authority.
Like he famously said, even Aristotle is a man.
Right. He wasn't afraid to challenge the greatest thinkers of the past.
And he encouraged others to do the same.
Exactly. He was a true champion of independent thought.
And that's something we can all learn from.
Absolutely. Okay, so to wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into Lorenzo Valla?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that language matters.
It does.
Oh.
Valla showed how language can be used to both clarify and obscure our understanding of the world.
And